So, yeah, I'm talking with Tara today. And to start to dive right in, I would like you to maybe say a few words about yourself and what you do and your label.
Sure.
Yeah, so.
Okay. So I'll tell you my experience in the industry and what I'm
Hmm.
doing now. So I have a background in men's tailoring, so that's
Hmm.
where I studied, and a lot of my industry experience is in the denim industry.
Hmm.
So that's where I worked in Canada before moving to the United States and starting a previous sustainable fashion brand, which I worked on for 5 years prior to starting study.
Hmm.
And I started study New York in 2009 because I really wanted to examine more intricate aspects of the sustainability movement in fashion, and I wasn't able to do that working for a bigger company. So I wanted to do it
Mm.
on my own terms with my own decision making. And so study was very different from my previous experience because I decided to produce it locally here in New York City.
Hmm.
However, the previous brand that I'd worked on was also using sustainable materials, so organic cotton and tencel and
Hmm.
linen and hemp, but only those materials. We were producing everything in India and China because it was a larger collection.
Mm.
And they were great factories, but I really wanted to explore the whole process. And so I started doing hand weaving and upcycling and zero waste
Mm.
pattern
Mm.
making. And I couldn't really do all of that exploration when I was working for somebody else. So I
Yeah.
needed to do it for myself. And so study is still very much that. It's an exploration in all of these different strategies of sustainability. Actually, that's where the name came from because I wanted to examine
Study.
these
Yeah.
strategies. Yeah. And in 2013, I decided to go off the traditional fashion calendar and
Hmm.
change the way that study is developed and designed and produced,
Mm.
and do it using a uniform collection that I always build on. But it's always the same styles, and I change the fabric sometimes, and
Mm.
then I add new styles based on the time of year or inspiration. And that's how study evolved. And my main focus was to try to decide what was really important to me from a sustainability perspective. And what I discovered was that it was really in textile development and zero waste and circular design thinking.
Hmm. Hmm.
I tried natural dyes, and while I love it and respect it, it just wasn't for me.
Hmm.
Um, I also do some knitwear development using hand knitters in Peru, but I also tend to gravitate more towards the woven fabrics. I think that might come from my menswear background
Hmm.
too.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, by the way, I'm a big fan of your calendar. I saw the graphic. I don't know how you say that, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, that was really inspiring to me
Thank
because
you.
it made it very visual. The peaks and
Hmm.
like, yeah, the difficulties with the regular
Thank you.
fashion schedule.
Hmm.
Um, so before we zoom into sustainability in fashion, I first want to ask you, what does sustainability mean to you personally?
Right. So I think my favorite definition of it, and I probably am misquoting, but it's basically using resources in a way that will allow future generations to also use resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose a lot of that is to avoid depletion of natural resources and
Mm-hmm.
our environment. So if we're destroying the soil today, future generations won't be able to grow anything.
Yeah.
And that's really important. So that's where I think organic cotton is a really important crop. But I also think recycling textiles, because there's so much material already being made, recycling and being more conservative is also really important. And I
Mm.
think that extends to my personal life as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I live in New York, so I live in a fairly small footprint of space. I don't have a big
Mm.
house. I don't think anyone does in New
Yeah.
York. I also recycle everything I can, and
Mm.
I compost. I try to buy minimal packaging. I choose things that are relatively zero waste when it comes to packaging, especially if that packaging can't be
Mm-hmm.
recycled. Right now, I'm on another second time project trying to make my bathroom plastic free.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Difficult,
Mm-hmm. It is.
but there's some good options now that are starting. I tried this about 5 years ago, and there were certain things that are just not possible, and now there's better options for things like
Mm.
shampoo and toothpaste and
Yeah.
toothbrushes. So
Also a lot of good.
trying again, and I'm hoping this one will take a little bit better.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, and when we talk now about the sustainability issue in the fashion industry, I mean, you already mentioned circularity, zero waste.
Mhm.
Could you define that a little bit more for people? You know, like what does sustainability in the fashion industry mean to you? Even though I know it's very complex, but
Very
just
broad,
yeah.
yeah. So actually, this is something else I should mention about myself of what I do. I don't just study the brand. I'm also a sustainability consultant
Mm-hmm.
at the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator. And we have a small run production facility here where we do research on um, zero waste processes and smart materials and more responsible materials and
Mm-hmm.
production methods. And we help local designers in New York and everywhere understand the process of producing and sourcing and being more responsible and the whole landscape of sustainability.
Mm.
So for me, zero waste is a method of using all of the fabric for the style and not having any scraps.
Mm.
But it's also a philosophy I apply to the brand in general. So you can see some examples of zero waste patterns, I think, on my website,
Yeah.
or I should add them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great book called Zero Waste Patterns by Timo Rissanen that I
Mm-hmm.
love and that I recommend, and I'm in there as well. But it's also a philosophy I think I can apply to the whole brand. So if I do produce any textile waste from scraps when I'm cutting out my garments, or when the production facility or the factory or the sample room is making them, I recuperate all of those and try to find a way to reuse them. So we reuse them in a lot of different ways. One, I work with a local weaving organization, and they make a woven textile for me that I can recycle, remake into new apparel, and that's the weaving hand sweatshirt on the website. We also take the smaller scraps and make them into the covers of notebooks that we send out with every web order. What else? And then smaller, little tiny scraps I use as a sort of an art project with my interns, and they make new textile pieces out of it. But we haven't sold those yet, but it's a fun kind of design process.
And very time consuming, probably,
very
right?
Time consuming, but also very therapeutic. I think being on a sewing machine, working with your hands, creating something that is one of a kind and really authentic, I think can be very therapeutic, as long as there's no time crunch or like strict rigid outline for it. So that's why I consider it more of a art creative project than anything else. And then circularity, sorry, I didn't define that one, but that one's really important as a general kind of overview of all of sustainability, because it's looking at where your materials are coming from, but also where they're going. And most of the time they start, you get your material from the land, organic cotton from the soil, whatever, and then you make the garment out of it, or you make the fabric, you make the garment goes to the customer wears it, and then what happens? So maybe they can pass it on to a friend or a family member or donate it, but then ultimately it has an end of life, and what we're trying to do is make that circular. So maybe the brand, I haven't started this yet, but it's something that I'm looking into, is maybe the brand takes back their old clothes, or takes back potentially old clothes, or you use fibers that are made from recycled post-consumer goods from other people or other brands, so that your supply chain is more circular. And I think this is not just individuals and brands that need to take this on, it's the industry as a whole. And that's where it's really important, because one person doing it, especially a small brand like myself, is just too expensive and too difficult, and the technology needs to be available to everyone.
The challenge is probably to really build this infrastructure, right? Because there are a couple of labels who are trying to achieve it, but still it's difficult to gather all these masses together, right?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So since the debate around sustainable fashion drastically increased, I think, throughout the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's good that the debate is happening, but I was wondering if you think that there is an aspect missing in this debate, and what is it, if you think so?
Well, I think circularity is a big aspect that is not missing in the debate. It's certainly very present and very prevalent right now in a lot of conversations, but the infrastructure is missing. And I think my main response to this question would be that lack of infrastructure on a global or even on a national scale, because once governments start to get involved, things move a lot more quickly. And while the fashion industry tends to work independently of that, manufacturing is a huge part of of what's happening in the world, especially textile manufacturing. And it employs, I think it's 6 million people worldwide, or is it 60? It's a large percentage. And a lot of those are women. And I think it needs to be served on a larger scale. And so I think the debate is really around infrastructure and legislation by governments. Part of that legislation could be about recycling or textile waste and diverting it from landfill and diverting it from the oceans.
That's also something I think a lot about, since you mentioned the responsibility of government and the industry itself. But what do you think consumers actually do have the power to drive change? Because I'm always, sometimes I think yes, sometimes I think no, because it's such a complex, situation. So what are your thoughts about it?
I mean, the easy answer to that is yes, of course they do, because if they stop buying things, brands would stop producing them. And if you take Fashion Revolution, the organization as an example, and that's now global, every country or almost every country in the world has its own organization of Fashion Revolution. But just look at the impact and the empowerment that's given to consumers to be able to go out and talk to brands and communicate with them and have a voice. But ultimately, the buying power is in the hands of the consumers. And I don't think that they're being persuaded to do anything that they don't want to do. You can say as much as you want about marketing, but ultimately people make their own choices. And so, I think they absolutely are able to make these calls. And the only thing missing really in that conversation is information and education. I think the only reason people make what, I guess, for lack of a better term, is I would call bad choices is because they don't understand the impact on other people, on the supply chain, on the environment, on their environment and communities. So with that information comes power. And I think it's a responsibility of the brands to educate consumers, but that's also difficult because they're only going to educate them to serve their own purpose, at least the bigger brands. So schools are doing a great job now of starting to educate, and the difference I see now and 15 years ago when I was working with interns and students and teaching is the level of understanding and education has gone from nothing to so much. And even at, entry level students who are coming into design schools or coming into any school, they have a basic level of understanding of the environment and impact on the environment. It may not be textile related, it might be, plastic bottles, but already the conversation is happening.
There's an awareness there.
There is, right. and that didn't exist 10 years ago.
And now my last question would be, because since you mentioned the education of the customers, I saw also on your website that that's something that you try to pursue, basically. And you do that with sharing your information, with being transparent, with, I think, adding the information on the hang tag. Is there any other strategy that you're doing? Like, how do you reach your customers and basically show them what all this is about?
You mean directly when I talk to customers?
Also in general, like with your label,
Right. So with the label, I try to be transparent on the main label. I put the name of the textile supplier and the name of the factory that made the clothes, and I have the sewer sign the label so that their name can be connected to the person wearing it because they see the signature, the hand signature. And that's because usually there's no connection between the person who made the clothes and the person who is wearing them. There's a connection between the designer and the brand and the person wearing them because they talk about it, but there's very little connection between the person who sewed it. And I want that loop to be closed as well. And so I think the label is very informative, and then I try to communicate that through social media as well. And then I also have a materials library that I've built for other designers. So this is not really for my customers, it's for other brands to help them find smarter materials. Because by putting the name of the fabric supplier on my label, that's interesting maybe for the consumer, but really that information is meant for other designers and students who are interested and want to contact that mill. Because I don't expect the consumers to call up my fabric supplier and ask questions. Maybe, but I don't think so. The idea is that other other designers will be able to use the same resources that I've found, because I've spent a lot of time researching them.
Yeah, which is great, because it's not, in that competitive manner, but more like in a sharing manner,
in the
of
sharing, the
moving,
open source, and
moving forward together.
I realize that I'm not a big enough brand to have a big impact on the industry, but I can have an impact by sharing that information.
Okay, great. That was actually a good sentence for the end.
Okay, great. I love it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara.
My pleasure.
It was very interesting. And if you want to, I can send you the link to the finished project if you want to see
I would love to see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then have a nice day, and talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.